VALD have just released their 2024-25 NHL report, built on data from across 5 seasons now and more than 2,000 athletes across the NHL and European leagues. Having spent 3 seasons in the NHL myself, this is something I find really interesting because historically we actually don't have access to this scale of sports science data in hockey. Data on its own doesn't give you the answers. So in this video, rather than just walking through the report, I want to focus on a few key insights and, more importantly, how you might actually use this kind of data in your own testing and decision making in your own setting. So this report is available to all users, and let me just quickly show you where you can find it along with all the other normative data reports that are available. So here I'm just in a demo account and I go into my dashboards and this drop down menu, and you have normative data reports. And you can see a whole host of different reports here. Quickest way, I think, is just to search NHL, and then you can see we have the ability there to download the report. The most common VALD equipment then used by NHL teams was force sticks, with 60% of all tests conducted on the force plates. And unsurprisingly, the most popular of those tests was the counter-movement jump. Now, one thing that really jumped out to me from their report was the findings around the counter-movement jump depth. That's one of the metrics I've spoken about previously in my framework for analysing counter-movement jumps, because it can be really insightful in terms of the strategy that athletes use to jump. In their analysis, VALD found that NHL athletes, compared to the European hockey leagues, had a deeper counter-movement jump depth and a longer contraction time than their counterparts in Europe. In fact, the median average for counter-movement jump depth in the NHL was minus 37.4 centimeters, which is in fact a lot lower than I have seen on average across a number of team sports. And that doesn't surprise me, given the somewhat of a squat position that hockey athletes have to be in for skating. So they're clearly a lot more comfortable then in that deep counter-movement position. This is a reminder to all of us then of the importance of population-specific data because of the variation in these metrics based on the demands of the sport that our athletes are playing. Another key insight then is around the single leg jump performance, and the report suggests that single leg jump metrics tend to differentiate higher level athletes. They saw higher jump outputs in the single leg counter movement jump in their NHL athletes compared to European athletes. This probably isn't surprising. Hockey, in a way, is a highly unilateral sport. Every stride, every acceleration, every change of direction is often happening off of one leg at a time. So from a performance perspective, this reinforces the importance of single leg strength and power in these athletes. But there are 2 important caveats here. First, this is, of course, cross-sectional data. So we don't know about cause and effect. We can't say that improving single leg performance causes higher performance, and especially in a team sport that is, of course, complex and multifaceted, only that they are associated. And of course, secondly, it needs to be contextualized within your own environment. But from a practical standpoint, it does support the idea that single leg testing shouldn't be an afterthought. As I've spoken about in a video talking about asymmetries, there is a difference between analyzing asymmetries in a bilateral task compared to standalone single leg tests. So this certainly reinforces the importance of standalone single leg testing as part of profiling in ice hockey. Now, for those of you who have previously seen my video in this athlete testing series with VALD on the force frame, you will be familiar then with the Adductor ratio and the fact that it's associated with injury risk in many team sports, and that actually the initial research into this ratio was born out of ice hockey. Let's have a quick reminder. So obviously a ratio of 1 would show that you're producing the same force output in this test in the adductors and the abductors. And the further away either side you get from 1, the greater imbalance that you have. And much of the early work in this ratio came from ice hockey, and specifically Tim Tyler. And his early study in 2001 showed prospectively that the ratio of athletes in this NHL team who went on to be uninjured in the hip and groin region in the season was 0.95. Compared that to the players who went on to get injured, and they had a much lower ratio of 0.78. So based on this work, it was suggested that in athletes, or at least in this case in ice hockey athletes, aiming for a ratio of at least 0.8 was recommended. Here then we have a preview of some of the analysis from the VALD report as it relates to the adductor-abductor ratio. And 2 things jump out at me here. The data distribution suggested that athletes with lower adduction maximum force output, as measured by force frame, are less likely then to achieve an adductor to abductor ratio greater than 0.8. These may well be then some of the athletes that we want to focus on the most with our training and with our hip and groin injury prevention and strengthening work, because that would suggest that they're not just weak in terms of an absolute comparison to the population, but they're also imbalanced within that same side across the hip and groin. In addition, this figure highlights that there are clearly a number of different positions being used to assess adduction and abduction force, and this ratio for 45 degrees, 60 degrees, which is the most commonly tested position in their data set, seated, and the supine position, which is commonly measured at the ankle, so you get that more long lever position. Ultimately, any of these may have their place, they may have purpose, but it highlights the importance then of consistent testing protocols and, of course, making sure that you are tagging it and selecting the data correctly in your data set. So the key thing this report provides, like all of VALD's normative data reports, is scale. We are dealing with a vast amount of aggregated data from up to more than 5 seasons worth, can then provide context to you with your own population of hockey athletes, not necessarily numbers for you to chase, but allows you to ask better questions around where do your athletes sit in comparison to the norm shown here? Are you seeing similar trends within your own data sets, or perhaps something different? The goal here then isn't just to copy exactly what the NHL data looks like, but to use it in comparison to your own context and to give some insight into how your athletes compare and any practical applications that might suggest. But ultimately, it reminds us that benchmarking only becomes useful when it's combined with context. If you're already a VALD user, then hop onto the VALD Hub to download the NHL report, as well as I said, exploring all those other reports that are available to you online. And of course, thank you to VALD for this collaboration and their support with our entire athlete testing series. This report also showed that the test with the most rapidly growing attention was the ASH test. So that's going to be the topic of my next video, and I will see you for that very soon.